My name's Sam Tuckett. I worked at a quaint, dingy, family-owned bar, located in a tiny little hamlet called Fairview, population 200. It's a small fishing village, surrounded by towering conifer trees that stretched as far as the eye could see. About 2 centuries ago, our settlers had nestled our little town into the dense, red spruce forests of Vermont. And to be honest, to call Fairview off the grid would be a disservice to the phrase. The most attention the town receives is from a few sparse truckers that had made themselves at home on their routes down south. My father used to tell me that the only reason the town existed is for the truckers. Without us, they'd shrivel up and die from the fatigue of driving endlessly from one forest to the next. The truth in what my father said resonated greater in me than anything. After all, the town didn't officially even exist until the North Lake grocery was built. The rest of the town seemingly popped up around it as just a distant afterthought. That being said, my family had made a name for themselves in our tiny little town. My great-great-grandparents had watched the buildings grow around them. Over time, us Tucketts had gotten to know pretty much everyone in the village, though not everyone approved of us at first. I'd heard that a few decades ago, all of the villagers out here used to be very orthodox. They weren't willing to sacrifice any of their own personal beliefs. So naturally, anything that was offered up besides communion wine was refused outright. But once my great-great-grandfather opened up the Foxhole Bar, he happened to discover that the locals here privately desired a little more alcohol than they let on. In fact, it turned out the majority of townsfolk here had been drinking at home and preaching on the streets. Needless to say, the Tucketts ended up turning enough of a profit to keep our bar in business and pass it down from generation to generation. That leads to me. For better or for worse, I felt confined growing up in Fairview. I wanted out. I'd set my sights on moving out of this small town. To be honest, the smell of fish had often wafted its way over from the nearby lake. If you stay long enough, it's all you can ever smell. By the time I was old enough to help out at the Foxhole, the smell already turned my stomach. And lately, the miasma of the waters have been smelling more and more rancid than usual. A dense fog had enveloped the whole town, like a thick, cloudy chowder. That just made me feel more trapped. Despite all that, I knew I'd miss the place when I was gone. I'd consider that my penance for abandoning my family's bar. But the allure of the horizon's light was enough to get me past that guilt. All I had to do to make my dreams come true was to complete my courses. All my parents had asked me to do in return was work an evening shift for them on the weekends, just from 9 PM to 3 AM. Provided I could do that much for them, they were more than happy to pay for my schooling. Even though they only had a little spare change in their savings, I made sure to meet their condition with unending gratitude. After all, in a small town like Fairview, any change is good change. But something happened the other night that changed my perspective. The familiar faces of Old Man O'Connor and his co-part Billy Brooks were in their usual spots. Off in the corner of the bar, blending into the knickknacks surrounding the wooden walls of the building. Their aged skin had weathered and tanned to a point they could be mistaken for being antiquated statues. The joke around town was that the Tucketts had to dust them off once a week so people thought they were still alive. Our family enjoyed the two regulars though. An empty bar is never a friendly bar after all. To me, I was neither here nor there when it came to their existence. Neither of them had ever said very much, not to each other, and certainly not to myself. But that had always been fine with me. I knew their silence meant they liked me. The only times the duo had ever opened up their ancient, rust-covered jaws was to chastise the patrons who had become a little too rambunctious. For the most part though, they both just sat in their small little corner of the foxhole, listening to our bar's old TV that hung up on the wall nearest to them. It was endlessly replaying sporting events that happened many years prior. My father had never upgraded the place. He was always claiming that he was trying to preserve the authentic feel of the tavern. Truthfully, I always knew he just couldn't afford it with my tuition costs. In the meantime, VHS tapes were still all the rage here. The TV itself was so used that the saturation had dulled the screen down to a near Western style monochrome. The only other colours appearing on it being that of a static line that occasionally ran up and down the screen. That night, I had my face buried in my textbooks for so long that I'd lost track of time. I eventually did my due diligence and glanced up to survey the room, and to no surprise, the twins were still sitting in their spots, staring up at the old television. But looking further down, exposed a third man's face. I didn't know this new stranger. He was older, maybe mid-50s. He had a bit of extra weight at his waist, but an otherwise slender figure. He had ashen-coloured hair that swept over his scalp, with a salt and pepper beard that ran the outline of his jaw. His wire-framed glasses were balancing at the tip of his nose as he looked over the foxhole's drink menu. I looked over to the dishevelled stack of menus next to him on the opposite end of the bar. I hadn't heard the door open, and sure as hell didn't see the old man grab a menu from next to me. I just shook my head. I knew I had to stop letting my absent-mindedness get the better of me, especially at work. No doubt, any one of the local folk would have taken a free drink if they thought they could have gotten away with it. I ended up waiting to approach the visitor until I felt he was ready to order. It wasn't until the tall, pale man looked up from his menu that I made my way over to him. I followed the elderly man's gaze towards the sound of static emanating from the foxhole's television speakers. Of course, that doesn't make the best first impression for the new faces, but that was the cost of keeping the authentic feel. "Hey there, stranger. Looking to get a drink? We're not serving any food options right now, so I apologise in advance. The most I can offer you is some nachos that I can heat up in the back for you. Microwave only." The sales pitch was the same as always. It rolled off the tongue like water from a faucet at this point. The visitor placed the menu down on the aged oaken table and tapped his index finger gently on the plastic covering. His eyes transfixed on the hissing of the TV. It took him a moment to reply. "I'll take a whiskey sour and a water, if you wouldn't mind." His voice came out differently than I expected. He spoke in a low, raspy tone. A tone that only emanated from an old man's throat that had long since exhausted its vocal cords. It carried with it a certain weight of authority and knowledge that only a proper orator could master. "Absolutely, I'll bring it right out to you." As I began to turn away, I saw the elderly man look away from the screen in front of him, his face turning to meet mine. Our gazes briefly met. There was something about his eyes that seemed to call out towards me. I felt like water spiralling down a drain, entranced by this stranger. I could only note that the visitor's eyes were dark and deep, a man who's seen into an abyss. I took a deep breath and turned away. I went behind the bar table and made his drink, grabbing a cold bottle of water from our fridge to go along with it. It's been a while since Fairview trusted its local water plant to flush the grime out of our reserves. The townsfolk had begun to strictly rely on the bottled variety at this point. Besides, since Stephen Wright was the only plumber in town, it was a safe bet that most of the pipes in Fairview contained more rust than water. I walked back around the bar counter with both drinks in my hands. With a quick motion, I set both of the beverages down in front of the stranger. He patted the wet condensation from the water bottle off on his jeans. "There you are, sir. Your drink and your water. No extra charge for the water bottle. Is there anything else I can get you?" Reflexively, I added the question, "Is everything all right?" I felt a shiver run down my spine. Why did I ask that? You'll only get 2 responses as a bartender from that little query. The first response would be for your patron to tell you to shut your damn mouth, and the other response is causing a grown man to break down into tears. Neither are particularly pleasurable to deal with. But the man just shook his head in response, still tapping his index finger on the menu. The sound of the plastic popping in and out of place echoed out quietly with each prod of his finger. With no other acknowledgement from the stranger, I just nervously bit the inside of my lip and turned back towards the bar. After a few minutes of keeping an eye on the customers, I pulled out my university textbook and began studying for my upcoming philosophy class. I thoroughly enjoyed that class. It was one of the few where the teacher didn't have to coax me into doing my work. Between flipping pages, I would glance up to see Old Man O'Connor and Billy Brooks silently drinking their beers and watching a game on TV. I'd then shift my gaze over to the stranger. He never seemed to move more than a muscle, but regardless, his whiskey had slowly begun to fade away. After a few more pages, I became enraptured by my studies. Philosophy had always interested me. I suppose it related to me searching for a higher purpose. One other than bartending in this ramshackle little village. I'd have clung to anything that would have helped my mind to escape from this place. Fortunately for me, college was a great way to do that. After some time of being lost in my studies, I felt the wispy cloak of a shadow appear over me. I glanced upward to see what was blocking the light from reaching my book, and nearly jumped. The stranger had stood across from me and was peering down into my textbook. Before I could muster anything to say, the old man raised his empty glass. "Can I have another, please?" he asked. The man's voice seemed strained, but more purposeful this time. I could only assume that the drinks were helping to take the edge off of him. Doing my job, I nodded. I felt a small rosy glow begin to emanate from my face. I felt a little embarrassed that I hadn't caught the man with his empty glass in the first place. I went over to the Foxhole's drink cabinet and began to make his sour again. As I fiddled with the glass, I thought back to the old man's eyes from just moments prior. The stranger had scanned and processed each and every word of my textbook in seconds. On any given day, I would have been impressed at the man's reading ability, but that night, my book had been upside down. Yet to this visitor, this fact didn't seem to put any damper on his reading ability. The old man's eyes had still swiftly flitted from one sentence to another. I could only surmise that the stranger's aptitude with words far surpassed my own. After turning back around towards the elderly man, I attempted to let out a soft groan, feigning an apologetic tone for being distracted by my studies. Yet when I looked back, I noticed that the stranger had already begun to flip through my philosophy book. "Oh, don't mind that. It's just a study book for one of my college classes." I waited for a moment, but the stranger didn't look up from my textbook. Curiosity got the better of me, and I asked the man, "Does philosophy interest you?" I shook the drink in my hands as the question left my lips. "I spent my entire life dedicated to it," he replied. The visitor's tone carried a weight of both pride and sorrow. He sounded like a broken, crestfallen man. "Really?" I quipped. "Are you a teacher?" I poured the elderly man's drink into a new glass and slid it over to him. He ended up taking a seat across the bar from me. "In a way. Though I'd venture to say I was more of a researcher." The visitor took his glass in his hand and looked down at it with a stare that spanned a galaxy away. "Did you work at a university? I'd like to say I could always use the mentorship of a good teacher." I laughed, trying to lighten the mood. All I got in return was a quick flicker of a smile on the edge of the elder's lips. Honestly, that was more than I expected. "At one point I did." The stranger's fingers began tapping on his drink before he brought the edge of the glass up to his lips. "Recently, just contract work." The old man took a sip. "Contract work? My philosophy professor always warned us the only jobs philosophy degrees will get you is teaching or speaking." I quickly added in a retraction. I knew he was joking, of course, but I've also never heard of a philosophical contractor before. I sat back down on my stool opposite this old man, my curiosity finally boiling over from the dull simmer it had moments before. The visitor sat his drink back down on the vintage wooden bar table that lay between us. It's not that unusual, but also not that common. Sometimes companies, even governments, like to have someone along for the ride to ask the bigger questions. I contemplated different tasks a company might have for a philosopher, but I felt as though I was grasping at straws. Eventually, I decided to ask this stranger directly. "Can I ask for a scenario in which that might play out?" "Mark 11:23, the stranger replied, barely a breath between my question and his answer. "Truly I tell you, if anyone says to this mountain, 'Go, throw yourself into the sea,' and does not doubt in their heart, but believes that what they say will happen, it will be done for them." His voice crackled out, but he quickly raised one of his fingers up in the air to silence me as he regained his voice. "So tell me, philosophically and theologically speaking, what does that mean?" The stranger muttered out that Bible verse word for word without any hesitation or forethought. It's clearly something that's been on his mind since the second he walked into the foxhole, and probably for some time before. I did my best to answer. To simplify the story, wouldn't it just mean that if you tell a mountain to move and fully believe it will, then it will? The visitor nodded slowly before jostling his head back and forth in the universal sign of close but not quite right. Yes, that would be the story sparsely summarized. But to expand the question in full, it would eventually lead to the query of what does belief mean in itself? What creates belief? And what are its prerequisites? The old man picked up his whiskey from in front of him and twisted it over in the palm of his hand. The dull, yellowed iridescent light coming from above made the glass sparkle as he positioned it back and forth in his palm. I could think that this whiskey is water, but that doesn't mean it is, no matter how much I believe in it. Well, we're also talking about a Bible verse. So wouldn't the first requirement be to believe in the power God? Otherwise, the Bible's just a story. The old man set his whiskey back down on a table and pressed his finger to his temple as if in thought. Or maybe you're a devil's advocate like me and enjoy arguing for an idea you don't necessarily believe in. A few seconds of silence passed before he continued. Play along with me if you will. If you took into consideration that the Bible had to be correct and our understanding of it is wrong, then what is belief? I shook my head. I conjured up nothing I felt could satiate his question. Let us use our new basis for fact to help us with that answer. Matthew 14:22-33. Jesus walked on water, and Peter called out to him from upon a boat. Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water. Come, Jesus said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and, beginning to sink, cried out, Lord, save me. Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. You of little faith, he said, why did you doubt? So tell me, Sam, why did Peter doubt? After all, he saw Jesus walking on the water. Even he himself had managed to walk a few steps on the surface, instead of plummeting into the waters below. His faith should have been stronger than ever. I paused for a moment, letting this lecture shuffle around in my head. I was never one to have true faith, so putting myself in a position to not just contemplate, but rather indisputably champion the Bible was a new thought game for me. I could only shrug at his question. It was the wind that convinced Peter he couldn't walk on water. External stimuli. Had this occurred in a void just between Jesus and Peter? Perhaps Peter would have been able to maintain his faith. A thin line of condensation had formed around the cooled, untouched water bottle next to the stranger's hands. With a light tap, the visitor touched his pinky to the pool. In the dim lighting of the bar, I could have sworn that the water reached out to him just before his skin had made contact with it. But everything Peter had grown up knowing had stripped him of the ability to truly believe in anything, the old man continued. Should he jump, then he'd subconsciously know he'd fall, even if he really wanted to fly. Belief must be implemented beyond our subconscious in order to even get close to what Jesus achieved. I placed my chin in my hand as the old professor spoke. It didn't seem like he was really even talking to me, but rather reaching out towards something else. I was entranced by the movements and the cadence in which the old stranger spoke. It was reminiscent of watching a play of someone's internal monologue, as if the visitor's inner thoughts were taking place right before my eyes. The stranger finished his lecture with a final question. So, if you were to conduct a test to prove that theory, what would you need to do? I pondered for a moment. I could feel the visitor's steely eyes resting on me for one of the first times that night. He was coercing a specific answer from me. I suppose I'd need someone who didn't have any preconceived notions on how the world worked. The professor, as quietly as he could, clapped his hands together and leaned over towards me. In a hushed voice, he replied, "Bingo." But that's impossible, right? Jesus had divine intervention to help with his faith. The rest of us start learning how the world works the second we're born. That's true. And that's the problem. A sigh escaped the man's mouth again. It sounded like sand billowing through a cavern. Age doesn't matter when it comes to belief. If you see your parents standing on the ground in an operating room from the second you're born, you'd never truly think you could fly. So age doesn't matter. Almost in a half jestful manner, he added, "Plus, a floating baby, though amazing, wouldn't be able to articulate what exactly was required to be able to float, or what true belief was. So what you would need would be an adult and a whole lot of legal red tape disappearing. So to create a vacuum would require a vacuum. You'd need a space with no limits," I quizzically remarked. The visitor took in a deep, painful breath as his demeanour changed once more. It felt as though the stranger's tongue had slowed down enough that his brain could finally catch up. Yes, we needed to find someone that we could turn into a believer by stripping everything they knew about the world away from them. There was a light quiver to his lip before he continued on. We'd need to lay him, the experiment, down and strip him of all of his senses, except for hearing. Eventually, we'd need to convince him of the impossible. The only way to truly strip all of his senses away would be to turn his nervous system off. The old man made scissors with his fingers and mimicked a snipping motion. I could almost hear the faint sound of shears cutting their way through the cold air around us. Then, you're only left with the head to truly deal with. Eyes are a hindrance, so we'd have to get rid of those. Even the wetness and dryness of the mouth might be enough stimulus to remind the experiment that it's still human and the laws of nature apply to it. So tubes would need to be placed over the face, one to feed, and the other to maintain enough oral lubricant to maintain true neutrality. Then, you let them sit like that for a while. Days, weeks, just long enough to get them to forget what it means to be human. My mouth had found itself partially ajar. The idea of doing that to someone was horrific. All I could muster in a response was, "That sounds barbaric." No, it's geniocratic. The logical opposite of barbaric. Scientists in complete control, willing to answer any questions that a philosophically minded individual may come up with. The stranger held up 2 fingers, pointing at each one. Evil to some, virtuous to others. If we could find the secrets of conviction, then moving mountains and walking on water would be the least monumental things we could do. For a split second, I could feel something negative inside myself rising to the top. I had to remind myself that this situation didn't happen. It couldn't have happened. Okay, so after they, lose their subconscious, then what's the next step? Well, up until this point, the experiment has been in complete neutrality. No sounds, feelings, bodily needs or desires. Just complete silence. He let that word drag on, letting the last syllable die upon exiting his lips and leaving us in the very definition of that word. You'd know, once their thoughts were completely emptied, by their medical charts. No more high spikes of anxiety or fear. Just a blasé, constant deep slumber. Now, once this happens, it's time to organically bring in concepts via audio that are antagonistic to our current known laws of reality. The experiment must be able to hear them. They're recited as fact, of course. After a while, we'd begin to see the charts begin to spike again. Except, instead of a consciousness dying, one is being created. The experiment would be monitored 24/7 for any strange anomalies. But after a while, the issue would be raised that he might be trapped within his own mind. Perhaps conjuring up worlds in the void of his own imagination, rather than that of our own reality. After all, at this point in time, it could only be expected that the experiment no longer truly knew what our reality was. So how would you handle that? We had to open its eyes. Well, we had to give it eyes. Its original eyes were tossed out at the start of the experiment, without even a second thought of needing them again. Poor planning on our part. So, we had to perform a surgery to restore its vision using transplants. It worked. The professor stopped talking. His voice trailed off into barely a whisper. What happened after its vision was restored? The air was dead and cold between the both of us. His whiskey was long past gone at this point. Assuming that the experiment worked, we would have artificially created a being of total faith. Factory made from subconscious to conscious. And then we would have brought it back into our world to prove our theory. The visitor swallowed his regret and mumbled out, "Tell a mountain to move, and the mountain shall move." The issue was, we didn't make a believer. We made a god. The bar fell so quiet that I could hear the ringing inside of my ears. The ringing was so deafening that my vision had become blurry. All I could think of was that whatever the stranger had just told me couldn't have been real. The experiment didn't know what it looked like, but it had faith that it was not human. And thus, it was not. It didn't know what its body was, but it had faith it was not bound by skin and bone. And thus, it was not. Walls could not contain it, for it did not know what walls were. Gravity, time, space, nothing mattered to it. What did it look like? I stammered out. I saw its form only briefly, after its flesh had been stripped from its body. He paused, trying to find the right words. Confusion was stricken across his face as his pulsating eyes darted around the dark bar table. Each flicker of his vision felt as though he was staring back at the man they had turned into a god. It was infinity, an endless, self-consuming entity of blasphemy, inconceivably quiet, muffling existence not just around it, but from every corner of every place within your mind. Dancing, pounding, writhing shadows of tissue and darkness. Stars surrounded by gaping maws, endlessly bubbling to the surface. Its presence expanded far beyond its body. I saw it only for a moment, before running out of that operating room. I was lucky to get out. His eyes focused back onto the water trailing down the bottle. His mind finally coming down from the sprint it had just been on. Since that night, I've noticed that my vision continues to pulsate, but I know there's nothing wrong with my eyes. My consciousness itself is damaged. After all, I have faith in what I saw that night. I was left speechless as the visitor placed his payment on the bar and quietly got up from the table. For the final time, we'd locked eyes together. The elderly man's pupils were dilating and shrinking, almost like a heartbeat. They were constantly pulling me in and pushing me back out. It wasn't until the stranger turned around and headed towards the door that I regained my voice. That was all just a story, right? Just a thought experiment. The old man paused briefly, right at the front of the doors. No. And with a final push, he left. He entered the darkness of the foggy night, like a diver into a pool of ink. He disappeared right before my eyes, even before the doors of the bar had shut closed. I was left in deafening silence, alone. It was after 3 a.m, and O'Connor and Brooks had already left for the night. I couldn't even recall if they'd said goodnight to me. Now that I thought about it, I couldn't recall that much actually. All I knew was that I believed in that old stranger's story, and the mental image of the new god resonated within my mind in a way that the old god had never done before. If the stranger's story was true, then I have faith that one day I'll see him in person myself. I need to let you know that you'll see him too.